Hi, this is Nick Katko, and welcome to today's webinar, Creating a Lean Performance Measurement System. Before we get started, what I'd like to do is just take care of a couple administrative things. First, if you'd like to get a copy of the handout, it is in your control panel under handouts and you can download it. If you have any problems downloading the handout, or if you are watching this on a recording, I will be glad to send you a copy of the presentation materials. Simply send me an email and we'll get that out to you. Also, if you'd like to ask a question, simply type in your question in the question pane and we'll get to as many of these questions at the end of the webinar as possible. So let's review our agenda for today. What we're going to do first is we're going to talk about the principles of a lean performance measurement system. Then I'm going to review what we call our lean performance measurement starter set. These are basic performance measurements that a lot of lean organizations use, and any organization that wants to develop a lean performance measurement system can use these as a basis for deciding exactly which measures you need in your organization. Third, I'm going to briefly explain the linkage chart process, which is a process we've been using when we work with companies to develop in a very short period of time an integrated lean performance measurement system, and I'll show you how to do it. Then we'll wrap up and we'll talk about we'll answer any questions that we may have. All right, so learning objectives. At the end of this session, it's my desire and hope that you will be able to explain the differences between lean performance measurements and traditional performance measurements. You can outline and review the starter set of lean performance measurements, explain what are good lean performance measurements that you can use in your company, and finally explain the steps in the linkage chart process. So let's get started. First of all, what's the current state when it comes to measurements? Well, for the most part, companies have too many measurements. I, a few years ago, did some work at a company, one location, and as a brainstorming exercise, we went through all the lean performance measurements that they have in the company, just write them on the whiteboard. They came up with about 156, and that's way, way too many. A lot of measurements are anti-lean. They're based on traditional operational practices. They're more financially based than operationally based. And the problem with them being anti-lean is they could drive the wrong behavior, or they can cause conflict between lean operations and what the measurements say. And they can confuse a lot of people. Most traditional type measurements are outcome based, and a lot of them will have a financial focus. Finally, long feedback loops. Between the time you get the measure and you're looking at what happened, trying to understand what happened, it's too long of a time frame. And lean works on a lot of more frequent time frames than the monthly basis. Another aspect of traditional performance measurements is that they're pretty much a reporting exercise. The idea is to report the measure, and that's a whole lot different than what we do in a lean performance measurement system. So let's review what a lean performance measurement system looks like. First of all, it's the measures. What are the right measures that we need to use in our lean organization that will drive our transformation forward? And we're going to spend most of today talking about these measurements. The measurements, though, are used, and I think that's the one big difference between traditional measurements, which I said a minute ago are reporting based. Lean performance measurements, it's using them. It's an exercise in using the measurements. So we display every measurement visually on a board in the area where the measure is relevant. We use the measurements in our daily and weekly meetings to understand performance, to do root cause analysis, and then we also use our measurements in improvement, the plan, do, check, act cycle. That is the purpose of lean performance measurements. It's not just calculating and reporting. It's about seeing them and using them. And this is, very important for an entire organization to understand, because it could be a change in habits and activities and actions compared to the way you use your current performance measurements. So let's talk about the principles of a good lean performance measurement system. And the acronym is pretty simple. It's SMART, the word SMART. So measurements need to be simple and easy. In any area, you really only need anywhere from 5 to 7 measures. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about here today is it's a rationalization process. You have to stop using a lot of measures which are not relevant to lean. Another aspect of being simple and easy is that these measures are self-monitoring and self-reporting. These are not top-down measures that are calculated, for example, by accounting and finance and then distributed via email to everyone. The area of the business that is being measured, those people, those employees, they basically, as much as possible, calculate the measure and report the measure. We want the measures to be motivating. And this is the real purpose of a lean performance measurement system. It is about learning about the operational aspects of a process. It's about solving problems. It's about measuring improvements. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's not just about reporting. It is about using the measures. We want to improve, and you improve by moving the measure. So the goals of improvement need to be achievable. They need to be stretch goals that, if you really focus on understanding problems and issues and you focus on solving the right problems, you will achieve the goals. A typical stretch goal in a lean organization is 20% annual improvement in a performance measurement. We want the measures to be relevant. They have to be relevant to the lean strategy. They have to be relevant to the process being measured, and they have to have some linkage to financial performance. Not a direct linkage. They don't have to be necessarily a financial number, but the real goal is to learn about the links between operating performance and financial performance, because any improvement in financial performance is going to be a result in improving operating performance. And finally, the measures need to be time bound. We need daily measures, we need weekly measures, we need monthly measures. We'll talk about this a little more in detail. We want to measure processes, and there are a set of categories of types of measures that we want to use. We want to measure productivity. What is productivity? Productivity is quite simple. It's increasing the output of a process with the same resources. We want to measure delivery. Our goal, we want to improve on-time delivery based on customer requirements, not what we can do, but against what the customer wants us to do. Inventory. We want to improve material flow in manufacturing organizations. Now, this measure could also be applicable in any non-manufacturing company that has a lot of supplies. For example, a hospital, a lot of supplies there. You might consider them inventory, you might consider them supplies, but we still want to measure the material flow of those supplies. Quality. We want to, over time, reduce defects, reduce scrap, reduce rework. Cost. We want to decrease cost over time. Lean will reduce costs over time. It's not traditional cost cutting. We'll talk about a little bit more about this later, like in other organizations. And really, I think it's most important how you measure the cost reduction over time. And then finally, there's lead time. We want to reduce the lead time through any process. And doesn't matter if it's a manufacturing process, if it's a service delivery process, if it is an administrative process. We can measure lead time and we can reduce it. So those are the 6 categories of process performance measurements. We also like to have some, what I like to call people performance measurements. And this is not necessarily how people are performing, but a very important aspect of lean is people are an asset, and they're the most valuable asset. So we need to measure safety. Now, in most manufacturing organizations, this is very, very common, and it's also very, very common in healthcare. We want to measure how well we are performing in terms of respecting our people. We want to develop people in terms of their skills. We want them to enjoy coming to work. We want them to participate. We want them to grow and develop as employees based on their ambitions. And finally, we want our employees to be engaged. What's our continuous improvement participation rate? Are people participating in the events? We want to be able to measure that. So we want this combination of process measures and people measures because we want our entire organization to focus on both, not just the process. So the next step in understanding performance measurements is how often do we measure? And this is very, very important because remember, I talked about a lean performance measurement system is about using the measures, not just reporting. So how often do you need to measure? Well, it depends on the process in terms of how fast does a process and the people that work in the process, how fast do they need to recognize and respond to changing conditions or the idea that there's some abnormality? Also, how fast is the process? How fast can any changes that are made be reflected in the process performance? A third aspect of measuring is what lean practices are being used and how frequently are they being used. And the real determining factors are things like what level in your organization are you at and the cycle time of the work in the process. If you're working in a manufacturing operation and you have high volume, and so you really have what we would call a short feedback loop. So you want to measure frequently because if an abnormality occurs in the process, you need to know fast to correct it because of the high volume. Now, if you're doing software development, okay, that's not a fast process. So, do you necessarily have to measure on an hourly basis? Probably not. Weekly might be better. Again, this is not cut, this is not cut and dry, but you really need to think about the way your business works. If you're working in banking, the people that are in the bank, in the lobby, that want to, deposit some money or do a transaction, that's high volume and short cycle times. However, a loan application takes longer. So you might have different types. How often you measure can be different even inside a business. Magazine publishing, okay, you have a monthly cycle of, for example, of publishing a magazine, but there's lots of daily activities and weekly activities. So you have to determine how often to measure. It's all about feedback, and it's all about understanding when there's an abnormality, when we have to adjust the process. Basically, there's 3 levels of measurements that should be employed in every company. One would be monthly measurements. Now, these measurements are strategic in nature. They're measuring whether your work reaching your strategic objectives in terms of improvement, for example. And it's a way to assess the initiatives that you have put in place through your strategy deployment process. Now, these monthly measures can be at a company level. If you're a larger company, they could be at a location level or maybe a division level. Again, it really depends on the size of your company. Then you have weekly measures. Now, these are typically measuring value stream performance or a major process. So we want to understand, how is the process performing as a whole, and are we improving over time? The third level of measurements would be called daily or hourly measurements. These are very operational in nature. And the idea here is, are we meeting our operational standards? Because here we have to adjust quickly, because we don't want to get out of, if we have a problem, we need to identify it quickly, take the proper countermeasures to get back on schedule, for example. Now, again, these operational measures in some businesses could be weekly, like, for example, the software example I gave you. Healthcare, you're probably looking at a combination of measures. So again, it's all part of developing the performance measurement system, and you really have to think about response time and change. Why do we measure? We are really measuring how well a process is executed against a certain standard. And we want to learn primarily why it doesn't. If it's meeting the standard, great. We also want to learn why it's meeting the standard. If it's exceeding the standard, great. But it's a learning exercise about execution and how the process works. It's really about creating stability in performance. We also want to be able to identify and eliminate any deviation from whatever the standard is, whether it's a short-term countermeasure to get back on track, or whether it is an improvement activity which eliminates the deviation. And ultimately, we want to strive to reach new standards. So now let's talk about some basic lean performance measurements. And before we get started, on this section, I want to stress that these are measurements which are applicable for any lean organization in any industry, and they're also applicable within any lean organization, not just in operations, but in all of your administrative type processes. So we call this a starter set. And we talked about the categories of measurements. And here are those categories I discussed a few minutes ago. So here are some basic strategic and monthly measures. We want to measure productivity, sales per person. We want to measure on-time delivery. If there's inventory, we want to measure inventory days or turns. Quality at a company level is very, very difficult to manage. Measure, not manage. You manage quality all through the organization. So it's typically not used at the company level. We want to measure, any cost as a percentage of sales. We want to measure lead time in terms of safety rates, incident rates, and then for people, it's about retention, training, or continuous improvement. The value stream or weekly measures are very, very similar. You can see we do add a first time through. And then at the cell level, we have measures like schedule attainment, which you can see based on the linkage there, it's linked to productivity, delivery, and lead time. We have first time through. We have some not traditional type cost measures, but what is driving costs. So these are the basic measures. I'm going to talk about some of these in a little more detail. And what's really important when I start talking about them in detail is to I'm trying to give you some options in terms of how they can be calculated and what are the factors that you in your company may need to look at to determine what the best measures are. Productivity, excuse me. We have the output number, which is our numerator. That can be sales, it can be units, it can be margin. In a business where you have long cycle times, it could be value-added progress, whether you're looking at it on a monthly basis or a weekly basis. For example, the software company, you're not going to be selling this, you might not be selling software every week. It might be a long selling process because it's a complex system. The denominator is pretty simple and easy. It's total hours worked or total employees. My preference at the weekly level, my preference is total hours worked, especially if you're looking at operations where overtime may occur. At a company level or a strategic level, just total employees is good. Again, when you're looking at the measure, remember they need to be smart, and remember the S. They need to be simple and easy to calculate and self-report. Considerations, it's about the cycle time of producing a product or delivering a service in your business. It's really a factor of the numerator more than the denominator. Let's look at delivery. So we're talking about on-time delivery based on what the customer wants. And on-time delivery is pretty much a yes or no, and it creates a percentage. The numerator is, what were the actual orders shipped, or in terms of if it's a product, if it's a service, what were the actual service orders completed? Again, in long cycle times, it could be value-added work. Your denominator is planned. So it's actual to plan, and what's the percentage? It's pretty simple. The cycle time issues, are come into play here also. Another thing that which comes into play is what is an order in manufacturing companies. Sometimes a customer will have an order with many line items in it. So you have to decide, are we going to look at on time by line item or on time by the complete order? And I think that's really important based on what does the customer think. If I'm a customer and I place an order with 5 line items in it, and I expect all those five line items to be shipped at the same time, that's what you measure. However, if it's custom, I mean, within your business that a customer places that 5 line item order and they're okay if they're shipped at different times, then you can measure it that way. Quality. The measure is quite simple. We're looking at a defect rate or a scrap rate. You can also use the inverse of a scrap rate or a defect rate, and you could call it first time through. Doesn't matter. You know, the scrap rate you want to go down, from wherever it is closer to 0. The first time through rate, you want to go closer to 100%. It's important to measure quality at a daily level to be able to identify root causes. That's the easiest place in any organization to understand where your quality problems are, is as they occur, because it's simple to understand. It's easier to understand the root cause. And I think this is and on a weekly basis, you want to look at improvement over time. This is why I said earlier when we looked at the starter set, why it's difficult to do a corporate quality measure, because if you're aggregating a defect rate for all of the defects in all of your operations, it's just a big number that doesn't mean anything. So it's best to focus on daily and weekly. Now, what you have to consider here is if you are in a service organization or you're measuring quality in administrative processes, you have to define what a defect is, because they're not as the thinking is not as common as it is in manufacturing. So, for example, if you are measuring defects in accounts payable, a defect could be a missing or incorrect item on an invoice that you receive from a supplier that prevents you from processing that invoice. Pretty simple. Anything that's incorrect and we can't continue to process is a defect. You can look at the same thing in terms of a loan application for an insurance policy. If there's missing or incorrect information, there's a defect. Inventory. The measures are pretty standard. These come out of manufacturing. We can measure days of inventory. We can measure inventory turns. Inventory turns is actually a derivative of days of inventory. It's just a preference. I think my preference is to try to use days of inventory, because it's easier for people to understand. We have 60 days of inventory, which means that's a lot. Whereas if you say, our inventory turns 4 times a year, people sort of have to do the math to figure out what does 4 turn, how good is that, or how bad is that? And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you are in a non-manufacturing business or industry, if you have supplies and they're significant in your business, you can apply these measures just like a manufacturing company does to inventory. All right, lead time. This is personally one of my favorite measures. So it's just the time it takes for an order to go through your business from the time an order is received until the product is shipped or the service is delivered. It's the average time for any work to go through a process. You can measure lead time for almost any process. What is the average wait time in a bank? What is the average time for a sales department to respond to a request for quote? What is the average time that it takes to hire an employee? What is the average time it takes to close the books each month? What is the average time it takes to process an insurance policy? What is the average time that it takes to perform an oil change in an auto service industry? Lead times everywhere. If you can't measure it, as I stated here, there's something out there called Little's Law, which is a simple way to calculate lead time. It's the units in process divided by the total cycle time over the work days. And as I said, lead time can be measured for any process. And it's very, very important because lean is a time-based strategy. Lead time is made up of the cycle time to perform the work, to create the output or create the value, and plus the waste time. So as you make improvements and eliminate waste, there's opportunity to reduce lead time. Now, I learned this lesson in my first job as a chief financial officer in a manufacturing company, where we embarked on a lean transformation. We were very, very successful, and I learned a lot. But what the lean leadership focused on was lead time. And before we started our transformation, our lead times were highly variable. Let's say they averaged between 20 and 25 days, even though the actual time to produce our products was probably in the minutes, not even in the hours. It took minutes to produce the product, but it took us weeks to get it out. So we set a goal of every order would be shipped in 3 days, and we were going to do it without finished goods inventory. And we got there. It created a tremendous competitive advantage and led to a lot of financial success. So let's talk about cost. We want to measure cost reduction over time. The best measure that I like to use or I recommend would be cost, or a collection of costs as a percentage of sales. One reason is that most costs are fixed, and that's something that lean organizations recognize. So, fixed costs are hard to reduce because they're fixed. But if you can reduce the rate of growth of the fixed cost, and your fixed costs don't grow at the same rate of sales, you're reducing your fixed costs as a percentage of sales. Another possibility is average cost per unit. So it's the actual costs divided by the units or the services delivered. It's difficult to measure cost on a daily basis, and I don't recommend you try. However, you can look at what's driving costs. What are some operating practices on a daily basis, which, if they are not controlled, could lead to greater costs in the future? One example would be overtime hours. If in an operation there's a lot of overtime, you'd want to measure that on a daily basis to understand why do we have the overtime and get to the root cause, reduce the root cause, reduce the overtime hours, which has an impact on costs. Just to review briefly, daily and hourly measures. Schedule attainment and quality. These are two essential measures. Schedule attainment is basically what work was scheduled and what work was completed on an hourly basis or a daily basis. Now, remember that the response time here, so that if you're in a high volume environment in terms of a process, you might want to be, you probably want to be looking at that more frequently rather than less frequently. I mentioned this earlier about quality. The best place to understand your quality problems is where the work is getting done, because it's easier to identify root causes as they occur. Now, other measures can be put in place, and you saw that on the starter set. You can have a measure of cost, which I talked about a minute ago. You can measure flow, such as, how much work in process should we have in the cell? How much do we actually have? That indicates that there's an imbalance in the flow. We can also include the people measures here, but pretty much if you can do quality and schedule attainment, that's really, really good. So that finishes up the review of the starter set. So now let's talk about the linkage chart. Now, the linkage chart, this is a process, and it's a way to create a framework for an integrated performance measurement system. When we work with companies to help them develop their performance measurement system, this is the process we work. We use it as a 3-day Kaizen event. And in 3 days, a company pretty much has enough to get started with lean performance measurements. So the idea here is to connect the simple measurements with the reporting cycles that are required. And what we're throwing in here now is what are goals and objectives. So we're trying to align goals, measures, and ultimately the actions, because we want to focus our problem solving and improvement activities on moving the measures in the right direction. So if you align everything from strategic objectives all the way down to cell measures, you're really coordinating a lot of work, and it's all aligned with the business strategy. So the output and the final product of a linkage chart process is something that looks like this. It's the strategies of the business, the strategic measurements and how they link up, the value stream goals, which you determine after you have created the strategic measurements, because what's the goal? Then how are we going to measure those goals? Because a measurement is really measuring the distance from some aspirational goal. After the value stream measurements are completed, we create what we call critical success factors for cells. So these are what I'd like to call performance standards. How should a cell perform all the time? And then from there, we create goals and measures. And when we do this process with a company, we do it on a wall with Post-it notes, and we go through. Can you use some existing measures? Possibly. For example, if you're already measuring on-time delivery against customer request date, you don't have to create a new measure. If you're measuring your lead times, you can use those measures. So the linkage chart process is really a lot about rationalizing the measures. If there are measures in your business that are not on the linkage chart, you really have to think about, do we need to continue to use them? Because remember, the smart measures, simple and easy. We only want 5 to 7 measures. So what is the process to develop a linkage chart? First, we plan. We want to use a cross-functional team, senior leaders, value stream leaders, and operational leaders working together. This is not an exercise for just those senior leaders teams. The more that you get buy-in, the better the process will be, because when we do this, we found out that a lot of these groups learn from each other about what is measured, what isn't measured, what's important, what's not important. As I mentioned, we use the Kaizen approach. We don't just develop the measure. It's not about having a nice chart that we display. It's about, in the Kaizen process, you actually go through and calculate the measure, and I'm going to show you how you calculate a measure and how you go about it in a standard way. And we create a plan to deploy the measures. Then we have the do process. So we're going to pilot. Any daily measure should be used for 30 days, and we look at it against some standard of performance. Weekly, you probably, need 4 to 6 weeks. Monthly, you might need about 6 months. So we deploy these measures visually. We conduct daily, weekly, monthly meetings, and we begin to use the measures. This is about root cause analysis, and this is the primary purpose. So it's a learning process. Now, through the pilot process, as you get through it, what we're trying to do is understand the effectiveness of the measure. So the groups in your company that are using these measures, are they learning? Are the measures simple and easy to use? Is it driving problem solving? And if it's not, then you adjust. You can make changes so that the measures are relevant to the area being measured. What's important to understand here is that this is a learning exercise and coaching is needed. So if you deploy daily measurements, there needs to be a coach there on a daily basis to make sure that the team learns how to use the measure, that they're doing the root cause analysis, that they're running their daily meeting according to a standard agenda. If you don't do that, very quickly, different teams will run their meetings differently. And as I mentioned a few times, the main purpose of performance measures is to use them for problem solving. Another outcome I've seen of not having coaching, whether it's weekly measures, monthly measures, or daily measures, if there's no coaching, people have a tendency to think that it is a reporting exercise. So we just need to report the number and put it on the visual board. That's all we have to do. If that thinking is allowed to become established, these people think they're doing the right thing. So coaching is needed. This is a using exercise. It's about using the measure. And so make sure that, as you go through the linkage chart process, that you have an effective plan in place to coach teams through the pilot phase. The other part of a linkage chart process is you don't have to deploy all the measures throughout the business all at once, like some kind of mass deployment. Again, that's very hard to coach and manage because this is a learning exercise. So I would recommend starting small. Start with one value stream and then the cells in the value stream. Go to another value stream and go to the cells in those value streams, you know, and just continually deploy them on a pilot basis. So you finish the pilot in one area, start in the next area. And this typically works. It is a matter of using the measures, and it's also very, very important to understand that this is a learning exercise. People have to learn how to use the measures. The other thing you will find is you will adjust some measures, but don't adjust them too quickly. I once created some performance measures. These were daily measures it was a magazine. It was a magazine publishing company. We created the daily and weekly measures, and I left. And I said, okay, use them, and then on my next visit, we'll evaluate. And within a week, people were emailing me saying they don't like the measures. And I said, no, we're going to stick to it. And I talked to some of the managers involved, and I said, we need to coach them through this, and we need to explain that, what are you learning? That's really the question. It's not so much the measure. What are you learning? So I talked about this. How do you calculate a good performance measure? And it's a 7-step process. First of all, you define the measure. So we're going to measure, for example, average lead time. What's the formula going to be? What's the average? Okay, so we're going to use a rolling 3-month average. And you got to think this through for every measure. What's going to be the source of the information? In the case of a lead time measure, we're going to get a custom report out of our system. How are we going to calculate lead time? Well, it's going to be the difference between the number of days from the date the order was received to the date the order was shipped or the service was completed. What's the frequency? Hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. How will we present? What's going to be the visual for the measure? Are we going to just show a number, or are we also going to show a graph of a trend over time? Accountability. Who? What? It's not. Who is not one person, but what team of people are accountable for understanding the measure and using the measure, performing the root cause analysis, and trying to improve. Who's responsible for collecting the data and reporting? And what is the intended use? Where will the measure be used and why? So this is all part of the linkage chart process. So each one of those measures that you create, you need to go through these 8 or 9 steps to understand exactly how the measure is going to fit and be used and calculated. So, time to wrap up, and then we'll try to take some questions. So here's some practical advice. First of all, it's really, really important to stop using lean-focused information as performance measurements. It will cause lots and lots of problems. Now, companies have a lot of measurements, and when you begin the lean transformation, the information needs change, and a lot of your current measurements may not work in a lean environment. And don't try to fit what I call the square peg in the round hole. The round hole is your lean transformation. The square peg is a non-lean measure. Don't try to make it work. it causes a lot of confusion in the organization, and it can cause problems. People are familiar with the existing measures. They're comfortable with them. So be aware of that. And it's not like they're not willing to use the new measures, but they don't want to give up the old ones. And that's the other thing, is that this is a rationalization process. A lean performance measurement system, and when you use the linkage chart, it's about these are the measures. If we have other measurements, we don't want to use them anymore. So like that example I gave you about the company with 156 measures, when we talked about these measures, sometimes the measures, people didn't even know why they were measuring. Oh, we've always measured it. Or, this, we started measuring it 5 years ago, but we really don't use it, but we still measure it. So you want to rationalize here. We want to simplify. You want to lean your measurement system out. There is a difference between measurements and information. I've learned this in a lot of companies that I've worked in where there's a lot of information requirements. For example, backlog in manufacturing. We want to know what the backlog is. How many orders have we received but we haven't worked on? All right, that's just information. But it's not necessarily a performance measurement. So be able to distinguish between information and measurements. And remember, lean performance measurements need to be smart, and think about simple and easy. We need 5 to 7 measures in every area. So in terms of lean performance measurements, the process is quite simple. We create our lean performance measurement system using a linkage chart. So we are linking strategy to goals, to measures, and ultimately to actions. Everything gets displayed visually. We're empowering our employees to use these measures to learn, to find the right problems to solve, and to put improvements in place. And ultimately, we want to move these measures in the right direction. So we're going to be driving improvement through our meeting cycles and our problem-solving activities. So just to wrap things up before we look at questions, if you are interested in our Lean Think Software 2020 special, we have offered individual licenses free for 2020. This includes unlimited coaching in getting comfortable with the software, whether it's a simple email question or actually doing a tutorial online. Simply go to our website. On our homepage, you can click on the register button and you become a user. Learning opportunities. Please visit our website. You can join our mailing list for any future announcements of events. We have blogs, we have videos. All our recorded webinars are available on the website. You just have to register. If you'd like to take any of the lean accounting assessments, those forms are free. We have what we call the Lean Accounting Community Chat. We ran it from April through July on a weekly basis at 11 o'clock Eastern US time. We're going to be resuming that in September. So if you're interested in finding out and registering for that, sign up on our website, and then we'll be sending out an announcement in a few weeks about resuming the Lean Accounting Community Chat. We also have a Lean Accounting community in the software Slack. So this is a private group. Think of it as a little networking group of people that are practicing lean accounting, people that are interested in lean accounting. It's like a meeting place. You want to learn who else is involved in lean accounting. Here's a place to go. It's private. It's safe. We don't sell anything. It's not like Facebook where anybody can join. And it's just about a way to connect with other people, and you can also create discussion topics. So, please feel free to join. If you have any questions about this webinar, you have any questions about lean accounting in general, you have my contact information, and please feel free to contact me at your convenience. So I'd like to thank you for this webinar, for attending this webinar. We don't have any questions, so we'll just wrap things up, and hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks. Bye.